Welcome to the DWI Guide podcast, where defenders of the Constitution assemble to prepare for courtroom battle and firm owners gather to develop marketing strategies that will revolutionize the practice of criminal defense. Here's your host, the DWI guy, Jake Minnick.
Hello, fellow freedom fighters, and welcome to episode 106 of the DWI Guy podcast. On today's episode, we have guest Emily Gibson on to speak to us about the very important topic of crimmigration. For anybody that handles DWI cases, it is so critical, so important to have a good understanding of the immigration consequences that any individual particular client facing a DWI charge is going to be looking at. Very, very important subject for us to make sure that we don't lose sight of some of the most significant consequences that a client might be facing when they are charged with driving while impaired. I got to know Emily during my first couple years of practice. She was a public defender at the Buncombe County Public Defender's Office for my first few years out of law school. That's where I met her, was while she was an assistant public defender here in Buncombe County. I looked up to Emily as somebody that always seemed to be extremely prepared in the courtroom, somebody that was always presenting the case very well. So I have a very huge firsthand respect for Emily's way of presenting a case and representing her clients. Emily is a native of North Carolina. After college, she worked at AmeriCorps as a volunteer at the nonprofit, the Hispanic Liaison, which provided direct services to immigrants in Chatham County. It was that experience that launched Emily into the idea of taking the LSAT and going to law school. She went to NC Central School of Law. While she was there, she interned at the Public Defender's Office of Chatham County. And then after graduating, went and practiced in Buncombe County as an assistant public defender, as I just described. She has since that time opened up her own primarily criminal defense firm, the Gibson Law, PLLC. She assists with criminal, domestic, and then a handful of civil cases as well, but primarily in criminal. Her entire staff is bilingual. Emily is bilingual. She cares immensely about her clients, and that passion comes through in today's episode. She is an absolute advocate for her clients that she is representing. After we got off of the podcast, Emily wanted me to kind of point out one more thing that we kind of forgot to talk about in the episode, which is that it is really important for anybody that has any charges dismissed, any type of charge dismissed, any client that potentially has immigration issues or immigration status in question or concern. If their charges are dismissed, whether that's a DWI, other traffic charges, criminal, whatever it might be, if there's a dismissed charge, get a copy of the disposition and the judgment, because if that charge is expunged, there still may need to be some proof as to the outcome of the charge for immigration purposes. So get that while the getting is good, which is prior to a expungement being filed, with the new laws being passed related to expunctions. A lot of these are now happening automatically. So make sure that you get a copy of the final judgment or citation showing dismissal. Make sure that you get a copy of the F1 screen or however you're typically documenting that. But make sure you get that and get that quickly after disposition so that you can show that outcome prior to the expunction being actually entered by the clerk's office. So Emily wanted to put that on my radar, to put that out there. I think you're really going to learn a lot today. I learned a ton personally from talking with Emily, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. So yeah, excited to talk about some of these very important questions, Emily, when it comes to the impact that a DWI can have on somebody's immigration status. It's kind of a big, unfortunately, I think, black box for a lot of us in terms of why this is important, what matters, what is going to have an impact. And so, I know that your main practice is criminal defense. You're not an immigration attorney, so we want to be clear about that, but have a lot of experience in dealing with the kind of criminal impact of a DWI, and then how that kind of cross references with a immigration situation. So when you just kind of go into the basics of it, when you have a consultation with a client, what is your means of uncovering that there might be an immigration issue? And then kind of what follow-up questions are you asking where you identify that an immigration issue might exist?
So thanks, Jake, for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's so good to see you. I know it's been several years since I've seen you in person.
Yeah, it's been great kind of catching up here for a few minutes before we started. So it's been a long time, but excited to have you on.
And trust me, I miss the mountains and I miss practicing there. But it's good to be back home in the Triangle, and that's where I'm from originally. So when I'm talking to any client, Jake, I'm talking about not just potential criminal record and a little bit about that person to kind of get to know them, but I jump right into a question of where are you from? Where were you born? And I think a lot of people really feel thrown off, regardless of whether someone's a U.S. citizen or not. That question is a little off-putting. I think there can be, racial, ethnic undertones of discrimination, or even just discriminating someone because there's an immigrant. And so many people that are immigrants are used to, being said, discriminated against, just, oh, you don't have a social, or where are you from, or how long have you been here? And so what I say right away, because whether it's on the phone or in person, my client's a little bit put off by that question and by it being so soon. And so this is before somebody hires me, the first initial contact, that initial consultation, and in going through the first few things before I even get to the details of the case, I say, where are you from? And I say, no discrimination, but I want to prepare you for all of the possible consequences of this case. And they can be very different for someone who wasn't born in this country, who doesn't yet have citizenship. And I'll ask them about it later if I'm not looking at my notes. We all know as attorneys, right? We might call someone while we're driving and not have their file. And I might, be in a situation over the course of a year or two where I'm asking my client, a few times, and they know I'm just not looking at their notes and why I'm asking it. But I remind them every time. It's really important to me. If your name is John Smith, if it's Fulano de Tal, I'm going to ask you where you were born, because who knows? You could be white. You could have been born in Canada. You never know. And I want to ask everybody. And so I determine right then and there if there's an issue. And for anybody who's a U.S. citizen, I don't really have to go down that road. Right. For anybody that is not a U.S. citizen, regardless of whether they're undocumented or have legal residency or a myriad of other types of legal statuses, then we're going to go down that road of other potential consequences for them.
And in terms of what that looks like from a kind of then follow-up questioning, in terms of where you go from that, what kind of back and forth you have normally during that initial conversation, or, maybe we'll get to kind of some of the follow-up closer to any trial or plea, but in terms of that initial conversation, what additional back and forth is there on immigration issues or status or anything along those lines?
Well, I always make clear and remind my client or potential client that I'm not the immigration expert. I'm not the end all, and that it may be that we need to meet with somebody, or that, and most of the time I'm advising that folks do still meet with somebody, yes, but that I'm going to prepare them for the consequences that I'm aware of as well. once I've established that somebody is not a U.S. citizen, and there's a little tidbit I have for the end of this, Jake, on how citizens could still be affected with immigration consequences. I'll jump to that for a second. You might have to remind me where to get back. But under the Trump administration, there were folks being denaturalized. And what that means is you have already become a resident. You've waited the several years. You've applied for citizenship. You've gone through the citizenship hearing, the investigation, everything. You've naturalized. That means you've become a citizen. You're sworn in as a U.S. citizen. And then the Trump administration was looking through naturalization applications, saying, was there ever any criminal record that somebody had that they didn't say they had, or something like that. And for several years, they were undoing naturalization applications. So you may have a client that you think is a U.S. citizen, and depending on the politics of the country, and depending on whether or not, they were completely truthful with their application, you might be in a situation where they are uncitizenized and become an uncitizen.
In terms of somebody like facing a pending charge, what would that, kind of conversation? Obviously, again, you're probably, saying this might be an issue, talk to an immigration lawyer about this, but in terms of that specific piece, would it be that we need to kind of determine whether there's you might want to verify this with your immigration attorney that you continue to have citizenship, or is it, that a conviction could cause could a conviction cause you to be, or was this something more like on the back end of things that they were looking before the naturalization process had occurred?
That would be more on the back end. So
Okay.
While I don't want anybody at this point to worry about anybody who is a U.S. citizen, I want us all as attorneys to keep it in the back of our mind that there are times that there may have been fraud that got somebody there.
Gotcha. Okay.
Or an administration that may look to undo something like that. And that's why it's important to have a good immigration attorney anytime somebody's going through that process. But Jake, I wanted to get back to the other questions I start asking my client about. So if I'm aware, okay, someone's not from here, so I say, where are you? That's going to give me an idea of things that we'll go through in a minute, but have a better idea of what country they're from. When did you get here is another question I go through. Have you left the country since you got here? Have you been deported? These are things that are important to know, not just to assess what the consequences of a criminal conviction of a DWI is for an immigrant, but what is the risk of them going through the process, and how do you effectively advise your client of any risk of being picked up by ICE along the way. And I want to be very careful here to say that anybody who may have a deportation order, or, we're not advising clients as attorneys, to avoid anything about the process. But I want to advise my clients as someone who's concerned about their immigration status, as what along the way, if you get jail time, what happens?
Yes.
Does ICE come after you? If you get supervised probation and all of that. But back to the questions, and sorry to kind of circle around, Jake.
No.
You got to reel me in here sometimes. Back to the question, I want to know, where they're from, how long have they been here? Do they have family here? Do they have kids? Do they have anybody with any medical situation? Have they told anybody? Are they afraid of going back to their country? Again, the deportation question is really important. Have you had a potential deportation? The definition of deportation can be, someone just showing up at the border and being sent back. And so some people think, I've tried to cross the border, I don't have a deportation, they just caught me there, but there may actually be a deportation on the record. But other things that are important to know is, what's your criminal record? Of course, we want to know that about everybody, but there's reasons we want to know what any potential immigrant has had on their record more than other folks, and not just for sentencing purposes, but also just that history of them and their family a little bit. And did anyone, without knowing a lot about immigration, you could still think, well, did anyone in your family apply for anything or get anything? Are you married to a U.S. citizen? Or do you have anything in process? That's one of the most important questions, because if my client has an application that they've submitted that's being weighted on, at USCIS, then that's the most important thing to know, because that, to me, that spells I need to urgently get in touch with their immigration attorney, so they're aware that our client or potential client has these charges, and therefore start the communication from there with them.
Yeah, I think that's such a huge piece of, not just kind of referring the client to an immigration attorney, but kind of having some sort of a conversation with that immigration lawyer yourself, because first of all, you learn so much through that, but also it's very difficult, I feel like, for somebody that doesn't, for the average person, very difficult to kind of understand how to kind of communicate legalese from like one person to another, from one attorney to another, make sure that they're kind of adequately explaining what was told to them, let's say by their immigration attorney. Even bigger difficulty if you have any type of language barrier that is kind of playing into all of that. And so, having that conversation with the immigration attorney of what is the impact of a conviction for X going to be, for my client, or what is kind of the issue going to be with this particular, immigration application process that my client is going through, and how does this pending charge, or how does a conviction impact that application? Kind of putting that in the immigration attorney's court is really helpful, but it's kind of like going the extra mile for your client as well, as opposed to just kind of leaving it on them. And I've found in my practice, and I told you before the call, this is an area where I feel like extremely weak, the immigration, consequences and understanding what the impact is going to be is not a strong point on my end. But most immigration lawyers are pretty, helpful in terms of just taking 5-10 minutes and explaining, hey, here's what your client is looking at, and what you should ask for. If it's possible to, attack the charge in this particular situation, you definitely should, because here's what the consequences are going to be. But in terms of like down to earth practical advice, a lot of them are pretty helpful on that front.
Yeah. And I found with my experience in the mountains, you remember I was a public defender there. So, yes. My clients didn't have money to hire an immigration attorney, but I had a good relationship with several in the area that would give me advice for my clients when I needed. And then they would even offer to get hired at a really discounted rate, right, to do requests for ICE bonds. And so there are people out there that are going to be willing to give information. And there's a group that Jake and I are in and really involved in, that's the North Carolina Advocates for Justice. And we just have so many resources about folks to reach out to. Can I jump into, Jake, because what you're talking about, I want to get into about, what is the particular approach for my client because of what's going on in their immigration case? Yes. But also just to generally assess and talk about our ethical responsibility as attorneys. Yes. I have been told a lot in my career that I take it above and beyond. So I want everybody listening to this to know that I do take it a step above and beyond, the Padilla and Strickland, Yeah,
Emily, if you don't mind to kind of lay out what that standard looks like and what we're supposed to be at a bare minimum telling people, because I don't feel like that's very broadly known, kind of what the minimum requirements are. And then obviously, if there's anything that you're doing from a kind of best practices standpoint above that, definitely please share that as well. Sure.
So Strickland says, that every accused has a right to, understand the consequences against them. And that if they entered a plea unknowingly of what the consequences are, that was not a plea that could be withstood, that could be reopened. And Padilla, I think, came along around 2009, back when we knew each other, Jake.
Yeah, it did.
And then Padilla says, you know what, if the consequences are where one could be deported because of it, you've got to tell them, and you have a duty to tell them. And that put a really high burden on criminal defense attorneys who know nothing about immigration, of how to advise their clients. And there's a multitude of things, not just DWIs, that could make people deportable, but also drug charges, and all of that. So with Padilla came this need for us as attorneys, right, to advise our clients as immigrants, to do that assessment, to find out if they're immigrants, and to advise them that this could result in your deportation. And then there's other cases since then that, is that really enough? If there's more specific, if you know specifically that they could be deported over that, yes, you need to tell them. And if they don't know that and they enter a plea, then that plea can later be undone because of ineffective assistance of counsel, because they didn't know what the consequences of that plea is. The reason I take it a little bit further is because I'm very lucky to be so involved in the immigrant community for the last 20 years of my life, almost 13 of which I've been practicing as an attorney. And I've really talked to so many immigration attorneys that I've learned a lot, but I really want you guys to learn almost everything I know that I can tell you in this time. So I'm really excited about giving this time. Jake, can I jump into what I would tell someone if they were undocumented first and foremost?
Yeah, please.
So the big thing if someone's undocumented is a lot of people just assume, you know what, you can be deported anyway. And I don't have to tell them that. My client's deported.
Yeah, right.
We don't know how this is going to affect them. But that's exactly what I tell my clients. We don't know how this conviction could affect you because we don't know what status you could be eligible for in the future. And that's where I take it a step ahead to kind of try to assess that and really tell my clients that if you applied for something, it could be denied because of this conviction. And right now, we don't know what that is. It could be some, new immigration remedy in the future, or it could be what we know about. And there's no harm in ever reaching out to an immigration attorney or me with any questions, and I can advise someone you can reach out to in your area. But basically, I've heard a lot of, if they're undocumented, it doesn't matter. I don't have to give Padilla advice. And that's so untrue, in my opinion, because somebody who's been here, let's say Jose Juan has been here for 23 years and has a clean record other than some traffic tickets, right? And he might get picked up by immigration completely unrelated to the criminal charge. And he would be then eligible for a cancellation of removal hearing. But for the cancellation of removal hearings, that says, you know what? Somebody is not legally here, but they're a good person with good character. They've been here over 10 years. They don't have a criminal record in the last 10 years. And we're going to cancel their deportation. And that gives them a U.S., legal permit to live here, to be able to drive and all of that. So especially once I find out people have been here for a while, 10 years or more, have family, it's kind of like, we've really got to fight this because we don't want you to end up one day in a cancellation case that you would otherwise have a great case for, to be able to stay here permanently for your family. And we've got to imagine, Jake, these are people who have lived here for, 20 or 30 years, even have kids and grandkids here. And I know everybody's got their feeling about DWIs. And certainly as attorneys, we see the worst case scenarios that are very concerning. But a lot of times as attorneys in North Carolina, we're seeing the .08s and all of that and legitimate mistakes that human beings are making without hurting other people. And the way that an immigrant's got to live is such a purist that they can't even, violate a stop sign or not wear a seatbelt. And the way that the criminal conviction would affect somebody as an immigrant is so much more harsh than somebody who's a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, it's, I think on a very broad scope, I think it's easy to imagine that somebody that does not have, citizenship or has not gone through one of the application process to become legalized, that is a kind of reason for maybe not looking so closely at a case, because it's like, well, they don't have a license to lose. What's the impact going to be? And really it's kind of the like almost flip side of like the stakes are so high for somebody that has a DWI in terms of possible deportation or inability to apply for either current or future programs like you're talking about, that these cases, I think one of the reasons why it's so important to identify that issue first is, yes, obviously we want to make sure that we're not unexpectedly getting somebody deported or kind of setting them up for that. Yeah, that's important. But also really kind of on the, processes that are available for people to go through the immigration procedures that are in place currently. You're probably like hammering a very significant nail into that coffin if it's a conviction for driving while impaired. I mean, most of the programs that I'm aware of, if there's a conviction for DWI, you're either not going to be eligible for application or not going to be able to renew. And again, I don't want to kind of say that's true across the board, because I simply don't know. But at the same time, there's very significant impact on that front. So I guess kind of in terms of that, when you have a client that you identify that with, what is your kind of then approach in terms of, do you do anything differently in terms of just kind of saying, well, in other circumstances, maybe I'd advise this client, hey, there's not really much here for us to try. Obviously at the end of the day, you make the decision, but I'm not seeing much here, versus for somebody that's facing this type of a situation where there's going to be an immigration impact. It's like, we've got to do anything that we possibly can to avoid conviction. And so regardless of really what our success rate is, if it's first offense, we're not going to kind of lose much in the way of sentencing if we take it forward. Does that play into that kind of analysis for you? And if so, kind of how does it?
It does. I have clients that still plead guilty because at the end of the day, they've got all the witnesses there. Right. They're going to prove every step. They've got the foundation. Or we do probable cause, which is the strongest issue, and then it's not so strong for trial.
Right.
And so I have plenty of clients that are immigrants that I've explained the consequences to decide to enter a plea, because at the end of the day, they've got everybody there and the judge is going to find them guilty. The important thing is to have advised them of what the potential consequences are so that they can make an informed decision, and making that decision that if everybody, is present and they can prove it. And then there's other times that, no matter what, and I'd like to briefly, if I can, kind of go through different types of immigrant status.
Yes, please do.
So, and I'm not the immigration expert, but I'll go through the most I see and what I see in terms of being the strongest to the weakest. Okay. So next to U.S. citizenship, you've got legal permanent residency, and that's really strong. But just talking about that for a moment, I've never really seen in my practice that a first-time DWI for a legal permanent resident has been a problem. What I have been concerned about is any subsequent DWI or even other tickets in their past or other future tickets that are just alcohol related, because immigration does have a classification that they call habitual drunkenness.
Okay.
And so even for a resident that's racking up numerous DWIs, that's still a concern for first time.
For habitual drunkenness, do you have what kind of qualifies under that?
It's typically usually several DWIs, at least 3. But I've talked to immigration attorneys about the potential for a lot of other alcohol related tickets and maybe 2 DWIs to kind of be enough for that. When people apply for immigration status, it's the whole old coming, through Rikers Island and, doing the health checks and the mental health checks and everything. And they don't want, alcoholics and, things like that. So they just want to make sure. So I have never seen an issue for, first time DWI with a legal permanent resident, but there can be several types of residency. And I still think it's important for anybody that we do talk to their immigration attorney as a practitioner, just to make sure and let them know, look, I haven't seen anyone have a problem with just one, but I prefer to talk to your attorney. And I see folks who represent themselves who don't have attorneys. And then sometimes we might just want to make sure and reach out to each other. Next, I would say the U visa, and the U visa is really strong because that is the battered, victim's visa. And interestingly enough, I'll diverge for 1 second only. You can be the battered spouse, get the visa, and it's a derivative visa that the spouse can get. And guess what? It can still be the spouse that battered the battered spouse that can end up getting the U visa here because of them beating up their spouse. I've never understood that, but moving on.
That doesn't make any sense. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Because the U visa is given to folks that are victims of crime, there's been a lot of leeway and there's a lot of strength to that particular type of status. And I think that folks who have the U visa eventually do end up being able to get residency and then citizenship. Now, I still, of course, worry about, well, how is this going to impact this client? And we can see the state record, but maybe we can't see the federal record. So I still ask everybody about, any convictions in other states and things like that. What gets really hairy is when you get to asylum is so rare that I don't even know enough about it. But I have a client pending now that has an asylum claim, and the immigration attorney has told me that this will not affect him.
Interesting. Okay.
The conversations I have with immigration attorneys can be, well, how long is the suspended sentence? How long is the active portion? Can you get it to be this? Can you plead it while the case is still pending in immigration court? Can you wait and keep it pending for a couple of years and plead it after that, or close the case? So it may be that the plea isn't the worst thing in the world for the client, but just kind of finding out the best way to make that happen too, and how that's going to look best on their paperwork. And I've had clients that have had humanitarian relief for various reasons that have, been okay with that. TPS is temporary protective status, and that's what folks have, should be having from Haiti right now. But there's folks with from El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. I don't know that I've seen other countries. I think there are. Maybe Guatemala has a few TPS, but from the hurricanes, the civil wars, the earthquakes, we've historically given people what's called temporary protective status, and that can be renewed indefinitely every 2 years. But temporary protective status is so strict on what you can have that you might have a no operator's license on your record already, and the DWI makes you deportable because you can't have more than one conviction no matter what it is. So when I look at all of that for my client, I think, all right, well, let me do an MAR, a motion for appropriate relief, right, to reopen the minor cases so we can make room for their one conviction. But these are just, we know in North Carolina, they're not going to, give us reckless drivings on these cases, but it's just a way of approaching it with each person so they understand the consequences and why you really want them to have the patience to let you posture a case for trial, to at least make that effort to fight it as much as you can.
Yeah, that's so helpful, especially again, just having that direction from, an immigration attorney, just, learning so much just during the conversation in terms of the different statuses, which I've heard, but you went through that really, really nicely. A recent situation that I had that just kind of blew me out of the water was we had a client that had 3 pending DWI charges. He got them all within a very short period of time. We tried to attack the first one, conviction on that one when the motion to suppress was denied. And so it was kind of then like, what do we do with these other two charges? What impact are they going to have? And so spoke with his immigration lawyer. He was here on a work visa. And basically the immigration attorney was like, well, I'm not, overly concerned about the DWI charges. It's not great. And I don't know, how immigration will kind of deal with this at our next renewal point, but it's not an absolute bright line, issue, especially if you've already got the one conviction. But he was like, there's a driving with revoked license impaired revocation that's attached to the third charge. And that's going to be a massive problem. That's going to be, what the immigration court's going to consider a crime of moral turpitude. And so that is the one that we've got to figure out. So we were able to go in, we ended up pleading the other two, but ended up having the DA dismiss the DWLR impaired. And again, if I was kind of just, thinking through it on my own, I'd be like, that would be the least of the concerns. But again, having this conversation with the immigration lawyer was like, wow, that's not what I was expecting him to say at all. And I would not have pinpointed that as being kind of the most important charge to deal with.
Yeah, you'd be surprised by sometimes how what would work out for your client for their case is actually doable. And how many times they're like, okay, it's not the worst thing in the world. But when I have an immigration attorney who's not getting back to me, who won't give me advice about how the second DWI my clients picked up, I'll follow their advice on the first one, but I'm not doing anything with the second one other than taking it to trial. Because in any doubt, that's my preference, is to take it to trial, because, and I will say my clients, feel like I have taken really good care of them, that they have known everything and that they have understood what the consequences could be. And that's the most important thing.
Yes, it is.
We can't save everybody from the conviction, but we can make sure. I wanted to comment on the DWLR impaired, because I think it was since COVID hit, there was a case that I saw out of the Board of Appeals for Immigration Court. And that was a huge concern to me, that said, they haven't even made that statement that a DWI is a crime of moral turpitude, but that now driving with license revoked, impaired driving revocation is, and it's really concerning. So when I talk, even in the potential client meeting with someone who's got immigration concerns, I'm talking about that from the very beginning, and the license suspension issues, and telling them, look, your immigration attorney may be okay with you getting convicted of this, but it's not going to be okay if in the meantime you're driving around and you get a drive with license revoked impaired driving that they won't dismiss. Now, my thing is, I won't plead a DWI if they won't dismiss accompanying charges or even other charges that are out there that my client picked up, because, make them do their job. And, if they're not going to do us any favors, right? But it's a real concern, and it's something that I'm trying to avoid for my client, even more than the DWI conviction, is to make sure they understand how this driving with license suspended. And for years, immigration attorneys told me it does not look good to immigration if they're driving with that suspension. And then it wasn't until the last couple of years they actually made that a crime of moral turpitude in that BIA case. I forget the name of it, but that was of extreme concern to me, because it used to just be considered traffic.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of, advice, if you've got somebody that comes in on a first DWI and they're not eligible, otherwise they don't have a license when they got the charge, they're likely, not anywhere close to getting a license. That seems to me like that would be an important thing to talk about, in terms of, look, we're not just dealing with the current DWI that you're facing, but also here's what the issue is going to be if you get a driving with revoked license charge in the future. We're not just simply looking at like a no operator's license charge now that's going to, still potentially have an immigration impact. But this is going to be much more heightened than that in terms of how immigration would look at that. In terms of advice kind of towards, future licensing, or what the impact is kind of longer term on the licensing side of things. Can you speak to that a little bit, Emily?
Yeah, and that's something I tend to drag on about with my potential clients, because I want them to really understand this issue is one we have to talk about. And as a completely bilingual attorney, I've done plenty of other attorneys favors to interpret for them talking to their immigrant clients. And one thing that I've seen over the years repeatedly is, oh, there's no reason to pay that civil revocation because, you don't have a license anyway. And you know what I've heard people saying is, you just can't drive the whole time.
Right.
And of course, as attorneys, we can't advise people to do something against the law.
There's the law, and then there's the practicality of what we know is going to happen. And again, you're not advising anybody to drive, but it seems ridiculous not to at least have a conversation about, hey, here's what's going to happen if you are driving. If you're caught driving, you can't ignore that conversation.
And to say my policy is, that I want to ensure that you are not driving a single day of any driving with license impaired, right, for an impaired revocation. And that the difference of when you just don't have a license versus that suspension. And my policy is to get all my clients to pay that civil revocation, and not just to take away the suspension at that moment, but of course to protect if they get another DWI, down the road. So there's not that additional suspension, during that might be, conceived as a level 2 for the first one. But just getting back to the issue, right, of the impaired revocation, basically what I tell my clients is this, okay? I do not want you driving in these 30 days. If there's a 30-day civil revocation, I do not want you driving another moment if you drove here, and I need you to have rides. And I understand the reality of that in a lot of places in North Carolina, even the Triangle compared to the mountains. I swear the reality is public transportation is not great here. And I just want to make sure that I cannot advise you to do anything against the law, because all my clients repeatedly say, but it's okay, right? It's okay, right? And I go, I can't advise you to do anything against the law. But there is a difference between driving without a license and driving without that suspension. And I certainly don't want to throw my client under the rug and tell them, you don't have to pay that. It's not worth it. You're an immigrant, because it's just going to
just be real clear on that point. Have your client pay that 30 days of revocation fee, please.
Regardless, because it's going to lift that suspension. Yeah. And then if they're driving, they're not getting that crime of moral turpitude charge that we're talking about. And also, unfortunately, we do tend to have clients that might pick up another charge, and that can avoid them some more serious consequences down the line. But yes, that's the big thing. Is I also, from the very beginning, have my clients set up support systems. I even sometimes have their friends and family call me and make sure they know how important it is for them. Because the way I feel, if I can go into this for a minute, Jake, is that my clients that are immigrants are going to be punished so much more severely. And also because I believe that the DMV regulations are extremely discriminatory. In 2006, I'm going to talk about the pretrial and post-trial limited driving privileges for a moment. But in 2006, the DMV changed it so you had to have proof of immigration residency, essentially, to be able to have a license. And then the statute for driving privileges says you must have had a valid license within a year. Now, I will tell you, I've used people with valid licenses from out of state all the time. And there are some states, such as Maryland and Washington, D.C., that tend to give immigrants licenses a lot more than other states. I think the law here with that regard is that it would be acceptable to drive under the license of another state if you're, also living in or working in that state as well. So they're going to be extremely prejudiced as immigrants, so that they can't even be considered for a pretrial limited driving privilege. I think there's some argument there, but the big one is the post-trial limited driving privilege, because if they're convicted of a DWI and we're just talking first-time DWI here, 1 year license suspension, or second time DWI and 4, then that's 1 or 4 years that a parent who works, who has to go to the groceries to feed the child and get diaper for the babies, and has to get to work. That's a whole year they can't drive. When somebody, just because they were born in this country and have a license, can get that. Granted, there's people who are born here that might not have the license and for other reasons, but that's important. And one more thing about that is I've just seen a lot of people, slough off and I don't mean anything bad about any attorney, because representing immigrants takes a special heart, a special persistence, and a lot of patience. And a lot of my close friends who are criminal practitioners just say they don't have the patience to deal with it. And honestly, I don't charge my clients more because they're an immigrant or because they're deaf or because they speak another language. I don't have to I recognize that people face barriers that they might not, need to be paying extra for just because of the barriers they face. But to each their own, and we all have to make those different decisions. And there is going to be that extra work of trying to talk to an immigration attorney. And if they're involved in the case, I'm going to keep them involved and let them know of the new court dates and get them the reports and all of that, because anything they have about the case is going to be helpful.
Yeah, I think, and just to kind of add to that, I think part of the reason is just a lack of really understanding on a lot of criminal lawyers as to the immigration impact. And so, I think part of that is potentially laziness of hey, go talk to an immigration attorney about this so that you can kind of make sure that you're appropriately advised. But I think part of it is just, again, for me, I just had no idea that a DWLR impaired was going to be worse than a DWI. That was not anywhere on my radar. Totally shocked. Yeah. After that, I called a couple other attorneys at the office. I was like, did you know this? It was one of those mind blowing kind of what's going on here. And so that's why, when you have a client that's facing these issues, even if you kind of feel like you have a good, understanding of how to communicate to the client, or based on, the kind of a similar circumstance in the past, I feel pretty confident with this. It just doesn't hurt to have a pretty short conversation with an immigration attorney so that you can start to learn a little bit more about the issues that might be kind of presenting themselves. Because some of these, I think, are a very unforeseen, impacts that can come from this. So it's just helpful to put it out there on somebody else's plate and have that moment of, look, I got something to learn on this front.
And a couple other things, just on things we've touched on, if I can, just some things I didn't want to forget, Jake.
Yeah. Just real quick before we move on to anything else, in terms of the license side of things as well, just like with paying that silver revocation fee, in terms of trying to get a client to have their license clear up. One other thing that I just want to make sure that we don't forget to mention, because you had said this before we got on the call, was making sure that they get their 508 form turned in. So completion of treatment done, right? So that I see this a lot with attorneys or with clients that have a immigration issue, or they don't have the ability to get a license. On the back end of things, they'll get the assessment, they'll get the certificate of completion, and then they just kind of leave it alone at that point. It's like, I did what I was supposed to do for the court, but then that never gets turned into the DMV, and they don't really care, right? It's not like a year down the road, they're like, hey, why is the DMV telling me that my license can't be given back? Because they're not going to try to get it. So just trying to advise them about getting the 508 form turned in to the DMV so that, again, a year down the road, their license will show as eligible for reinstatement. So they're no longer in that revocation period.
And I think that's one thing a lot of people don't realize about attorneys is just how much we push paperwork and push other agencies to do the work they need to do. Right. And I've seen, I think I tend to see more with English speaking clients that are citizens that they kind of maybe remember to get back to the agency to let them know about the conviction. But I just don't take it upon any of my clients to do that. And we do that as part of the DWI procedure for everybody. And I've seen it a lot over the years with immigrants that the 508 form didn't get in. And the reason is that somebody who can go get their license a year later is going to see something that's stopping it and say, what is it? And then, they're going to call their attorney, and hopefully the attorney is going to help them make sure that the agency sends the 508 form. But the DMV, sorry.
No, sorry. I mean, what's your process for doing that? Because that's not something that we're doing as an office in terms of kind of like having that proactive reach out to the to the assessing agency or the place where the treatment of completion is done. Is that something that you're doing after the conviction is entered, or what does your process look like for doing
it? Is, and the way I've had to add that into the process to not forget is after the conviction, we'll do the final letter and we'll get the documentation on the case together for the client. At that point, we make a series of tests and we keep the case pending, and we keep it in an area in the office where it's like the pending closed DWIs.
Okay.
And then what we do is we get that paperwork from the court and get it to the agency. It's a lot of hands-on. It's a lot. And I understand why a lot of folks don't do it, because I've had to hire extra admin and pay a lot of overhead just to make sure all these things can get done in my office.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And so what we do is then a lot of times it even takes, 5 or 6 calls with an agency. Then we wait until finally they've told us they've actually sent it. We wait at least a week and we follow up with DMV, but then starts the DMV calls that we do once a week. And it might still take another month or 2 for them to finally clear it up. And once I moved from Asheville to Raleigh, I was able to go to the DMV headquarters every week and talk to a hearing officer and get them to clear this stuff up right away. And that stuff doesn't exist. So it's back like I'm practicing where you are.
Right.
And how do we do that? And so it's really a matter of getting the paperwork for the agency that shows the conviction date and having them be able to, but I can't trust that an agency, no matter how much we push them, is going to actually get it sent, which is why I'm really particular about the agencies my clients use. And just as another piece of advice, especially for folks that might need an interpreter or a language barrier, I don't know, sorry to diverge for a second, Jake.
No, this is great.
Okay, but the agencies actually usually meet with the person once, and then they have to come back for a second part of the assessment, is what I understand. And the reason I found that out is because I used to run into the folks who worked for agencies over at the DMV headquarters, and they were picking up their driving records. And I have always been involved with, okay, well, once I knew that, right, and then I knew my client was going to go in twice, I said, okay, and we're like really hands-on, because my clients, it's like 80% of my clients are immigrants maybe, and they're super scared. And so we want to help them through everything. We just go with our clients everywhere to just be with them, and it's a lot, and it's a lot, and not everybody can have that capacity. Basically, it takes sometimes 3 or 4 months of my admin staff continuing to work on making sure that paperwork gets updated. And our goal is, before the end of the 12 months of the suspension, to have a driving record that shows that that's cleared up. And when the suspension date ends, get that driving record for the client and inform them officially, we've made sure all this has gone through. And now look, you will be just driving without a license if you can't get one as of this date. And we get them a new driving record to look at. It's a lot, and I should charge more for it, but we've all got to figure out those business decisions on our own.
Yeah. I just want to say that is just such an awesome kind of extra set of steps. And there'll be some discussions here just in terms of what you've just said about taking some of those additional steps, because it is like this confusing piece, and whether this has been turned in or not. And I think part of the practical way to wrap your brain around hey, maybe this would actually be a good part of my practice is that is a lot of additional work. And it is something that you're, kind of putting the extra legwork in up front. So there's a cost to that, but there's also a cost to having to have frequent calls a year down the road with somebody that says, hey, I went to the DMV and they won't give me my license back, and I can't figure out why. And now you go back and do all of the backtracking, or you have a call with an angry client, and they're saying, I'm my assessing agency never got this turned in.
Yeah.
I can't find them now. They're not there anymore. What do I do? Like at that point, you're kind of back in it anyway. So, it's, not to say that kind of matches the time that you're putting in where you are, but again, you're going above and beyond to make that happen. But there is like a time benefit to some extent of doing that as well, because if you get that angry caller a year down the road, it's not a quick fix there. There's no kind of like easy fix. And then I feel like, they're probably rightly kind of thinking to themselves, why did we not kind of make sure this was done back a year ago when we went to court and we had the certificate of completion in hand? Like, why was this not addressed? And as much as it may be primarily the fault of the assessor, it's also kind of like, well, we should be helping out through that process as well. So
you also have to have a super anal boss that has, a 33-page single typed policy manual. And, but the other thing that's really helpful for the clients is we tell them to hold off on making their, assessment, because we get that BAC, the blood alcohol content and their driving record. We contact the agency, we get that to them, and then we text the client, okay, now they have everything. And that avoids them the hassle of meeting with them once, them having to go get the driving record. And once agencies found out we were doing that, I had them following me around in DMV saying, give me your card, give me your card. Yeah, and right. Even some of First Step Services sends us clients when they can. Most of the agencies get the clients after they have their attorneys, but it's certainly, and it's not done for referrals, but these are things that do help you show the community that you care.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it shows everybody that you care. It shows to the agency that you care about your clients. I mean, that's a huge extra step. And again, you're going above and beyond, but the beauty of kind of, this forum in terms of conversation is to take some of these best practices and make it more of a public thing where everybody's doing that. I mean, that's the goal, is to elevate the bar across the state. And again, I can tell you right now that we're not doing that, but I plan on following your example, Emily, because it's really a big deal. I mean, it is extra steps, but it's also just such a huge benefit to the client at pretty limited cost to us in comparison. I mean, just having a basic understanding of what needs to happen, the language, who to contact, it's like we already got all that information already figured out.
Yeah. Sometimes I can't pay myself, but my clients all get their
That's so cool. No, it's really, really awesome to hear that.
And just a couple quick things to end. I didn't mention Daca, and I wanted to, because that's deferred action.
Actually, I got a text. I sent an email out to the team and said, hey, what should we talk about? Oh, cool. And Blake Marcus here in the office, he was like, talk about Daca. Make sure you ask about Daca. So I'm glad you're bringing that up. So
Daca is what came out with Obama's the one who came out with Daca. And that was for all the folks that were called dreamers, the activists who had been here since they were young kids, had grown up here and wanted some path to citizenship. Daca is not a path to even residency or citizenship. The only benefits are that, it's slowing down any time that you might be here illegally, right? Okay. And that's a reason for other future immigration cases and all of that.
You can get a license, though, correct?
And you can get a license, but you can't get a DWI conviction or your DACA's done.
For sure. Yep.
And so anyone that I have with DACA is only for trial.
Yes.
And no matter what, if everybody's there, I don't want to, advise my client to plead. I will tell you what's weird is a lot of people with DACA who have gotten the convictions are just kind of like, some of my clients, right, are like, I'll just go back to living like I'm undocumented. But it's extremely sad to come into this world where now you're allowed to have licenses,
right,
allowed to be considered here legally, even though you're not really what the DACA says, the deferred action. It's deferring your deportation but it's not actually granting legal status. Okay. So it's really at the bottom of that, the strongest down, and just one DWI conviction is a killer for someone with Daca. And I see clients, that have got kids and have Daca, clean records, and a .08 DWI, and it's over for them. Right. And they've applied, to a system that now has their address. And I would never advise anyone to move away or anything like that, because I just don't advise people to avoid processes. But the clients need to know that they've got to fight the case. They've got to take it all the way, probably appeal and take it in front of a jury, depending on what the client wants to do. And at the end of the day, sometimes the best thing that we can do is really prepare people for what the worst is, what the best case situation we really think we're going to get in that case. And, supervised probation, I've never had anyone go on it that wasn't deported. ICE actually is connected to the database and can see the list of people who are on supervised probation. And I remember when I was in Buncombe, it was a safe communities. Yes. Do they have the 287G or anything like that?
No, they do not. And, I guess, in terms of a practical standpoint, a lot of times, we just kind of err on the side of caution in terms of telling clients, if you, get a, DWI, in theory, could ICE be in the courtroom? Yes. Do we see that in Buncombe County? On a practical level, we don't, but who knows? They could be, present in the courtroom like they used to. I used to see that in Henderson County all the time. There would be, ICE agents in the courtroom. Supervised probation, same thing, almost as county specific in terms of, if you're on supervised probation in this county, you can kind of bank on ICE going to get involved at some point. In Buncombe County, we don't typically see that, but I always just kind of tell, because it's so changing, I always just tell clients, look, if you go into supervised probation, there's just no guarantees that ICE will not get involved on that front. So again, kind of giving the, here's what, we've seen, but you got to kind of plan on, ICE officer potentially being present in the courtroom or showing up. Probation.
And that's what my clients try to tell. And I have some clients that I have to talk to every night before their court dates, because they're literally so scared.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, we have these. You may remember this. I don't remember when they started this, but we have these bike officers in Asheville that wear the yellow, kind of uniform is built in, the shoulders.
I think I remember that.
And so they wear these uniforms, and then when it's the bike officers day, there's 7 of them. So we've had multiple times where clients will call freaking out, because they're ICE is here in the courtroom, and it's the bike officers. So that actually always kind of gives me a little bit of a chuckle, not to laugh at people's anxiety, but it's these bike officers do not realize the panic that they are causing people when they're
what you let your clients know.
So it's hard to predict when their court dates are going to be, because they don't have a consistent schedule. But it's definitely I think that's something that anybody that's handled DWI cases with somebody that has a immigration concern, that's front and center, right? What is going to happen? That's the biggest concern, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And the biggest concern is going to jail or ICE picking them up. And out Durham and Johnston County has had a lot of ICE picking people up in the counties, especially when it was, second or third DWI, and especially if someone's had a deportation order. Wake County used to have the 287G, which allowed them to put holds on everybody who is undocumented. And so it's somebody who just gets arrested on even a .06. We've seen these retrograde extrapolation cases and gets deported over it, just because ICE is in the jail. And I had one client once who insisted he only had 1 beer. I absolutely believed him. The officer was super shady, ended up getting about 300 cases dismissed because the officer lied in court. That came out later. But for years, I thought that I literally had a client that had 1 beer and was deported over it. And so I tell my immigrant clients with language barriers, if you encounter somebody that's racist, they're going to just use the fact they can't communicate with you and you smell like alcohol, and they're going to arrest you.
Right.
And you can't risk that happening. You can't drink any. And I'm not trying to tell people not to be realistic, but how careful you have to be.
Right.
And I'm not like, well, one, you have to go to court, because if not, you're going to get an order for arrest. And that's the worst case situation.
Right, exactly.
And two, I can't ever guarantee you that you're not going to have an encounter with ICE. In my experience in this county, based on this, I don't see any worry.
Right.
But I can't ever guarantee. And I've seen people win charges that are in custody and get out, and I still picks them up at the door of the jail for having no conviction. So supervised probation is a concern, jail time's a concern, depending on the county. And, sometimes my clients prefer to do active time only on level 1, level 2, sentences, rather than do supervised probation and a split. And honestly, I have a lot of people tell me, why do you have your immigrant clients pay all this money to get scram or, do rehab? And the way I see it is every client has the potential to do the most that they can to avoid the consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's a huge part of our conversation. I mean, we have a lot of immigration clients or clients with immigration issues that do inpatient, the screening.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like one of the first boxes to check, because, it's not only because you're trying to kind of, minimize immigration impact long-term, but the fear of like being in custody, not really from being in jail, but just from like a deportation side is so real. It's kind of like, anything that you can kind of do to help, tell people, well, here's the, again, I can't guarantee anything. I don't know what the judge is going to do, but here's what the statute allows in terms of mitigation. And we've got judges that really want you to go to treatment and want you to kind of get this help that's laid out. And they see that as a really positive sign. So, most judges, I feel like, do buy into those kind of brownie points that are allowed under the statute.
And my clients, for the most part, just say, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to do.
Yeah.
And whatever they can afford, they're going to do. And all right, I talked about my list. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure.
No. I mean, that just super informative, Emily. I mean, I think that this is one of those areas, like I said at the beginning of our recording here. It's just something that it's really important, and it is for a lot of us, I think, a black box of just kind of unknowns, and so we just kind of kick everything to the immigration lawyer, right? Like, go talk to an immigration lawyer and let them see. And I think it's really important for us to kind of slowly start to build in what's the impact of this going to be, so that I can know that. Again, it doesn't mean you have to go start handling immigration cases. I mean, that there's a ton of great immigration lawyers out there that are more than happy to help. I feel like immigration lawyers, for the most part, this is maybe like true across the board, but a lot of people that go into that line of work are passion people, like they're all in on trying to help clients and do anything that they can to kind of minimize whatever impact they're facing. So, it's just a really great conversation to have. And thank you so much for kind of just suggesting this as a topic. I was really excited about it, and I learned a ton.
Oh, thanks, Jake. And, sometimes we just can't avoid the inevitable. And, but we've just got to make sure our clients make an informed decision.
That's it. Informed decision. That's at the end of the day, that's what we're helping them do. Well, I can't thank you enough, Emily, for all of the information. Really enjoyed the conversation.
I really enjoyed getting to see you, Jake. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
If you found the information in this podcast to be valuable, I simply ask that you pay it forward and share this podcast with another member of the legal community. Also, if you would leave us a rating or a review on whatever platform you are listening on, I would greatly appreciate it.